we've all heard of the community of Wallachine, and there is a new book that has been published by this man, Larry Jacobson. We have the title here and the cover of the book. Larry, thank you for joining us today, first of all. And I haven't read this whole book that you've had published last August, but I have thumbed through it several times, and I find it very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, it's called Wallachine, Birth of a Legend, and it's sort of about the rise and the fall of this community and what happened there. And there's no easy way to talk about, putting it in a nutshell, but perhaps you could attempt to.
Well, I could tell you how I came to be there to start with. I had just come back from Yakima, Washington on a bridge project. The company sent me to Wallachine to pioneer a rock quarry. They had a contract to crush ballast for the CPR. Ballast is the gravel that goes underneath and between the ties and the railway. So I spent a couple of months there. I actually had a house trailer set up at Savannah. But I spent my time at Wallachine. And that's where I heard the old story about all these remittance men buying this place, and then going off to war and all being killed. What happened was that I had written another book called Jewel of the Kootenays, and one of the fellows who bought it was a retired engineer whose father had been involved in this project. His dad had worked on it, building the flume. His uncle, who was a fresh graduate from McGill University in civil engineering, had also worked on it. He was killed during World War I.
Okay, as you continue, I thought perhaps we could show some of the pictures that are in this book. They're wildly fascinating. It shows some of the original homes. So if we could go to those and sort of, as we talk about it, we'll just look at the pictures. You felt compelled to tell the story because you thought there were some inaccuracies about what led to the rise and then the fall of this community.
Yes, there were a number of inaccuracies. One was that the flume was built by the settlers, who were too stubborn or ignorant to get professional help. Of course, they had nothing to do with building the flume. It was built by the development company, the British Columbia Development Association. And they had engineers on staff. They had no fewer than 4 engineers on staff while that flume was being built. Another misconception was built with reject lumber. Well, I would love to be able to buy lumber like that today. 2x12 shiplap. 2x10 shiplap, 16-footers, all of them 16-footers that I've seen. So that's a long ways from reject. There you can see them, that's 2x12 shiplap right there.
That looks like good lumber.
Notice the way they've even dapped sleepers, like the joists underneath, so that posts can't spread from the pressure of the water.
So the flume was built properly?
Oh, it was built to the exacting standards of the day. The trestles would rival anything the CPR built then.
Then what led to the fall of this community if it was not this?
Well, there were several factors. Certainly the flume was it was an important event. They had a flash flood in 1918. They had a humongous rainstorm, 1 in a 100-year type of event. That the water came down those hillsides, carrying debris with it. Nothing could withstand it. But there were other things that got in the way as well. Probably the most important was that produce prices dropped to half what they had been. Another very important one that I haven't seen covered anywhere was that the purchasing power for buying the land dried up when the guys went off to war. Mm-hmm. You know, here they have only sold 20% of the land, and the guys all leave for war, and there's nobody left to buy the property.
Okay.
They had gone heavily into debt, what we'd call over-leveraged in the financial community. And so when the debentures were called, the company went bankrupt.
We should have prefaced this by saying that Wallachine was in its glory days about a century ago. How long did those glory days last, Larry, before things began to fall?
Well, of course, the best years were from 1908 to until the war started. But even then, there were still a lot of people left. You know, people who weren't fit to go in the army, and So I would say that the place was not too bad up until the mid-1920s, at least on the south side of the river, where they didn't depend on that big flume. The north side, of course, it was wiped out in 1918, and there was no money to rebuild it. The company had gone bankrupt in 1912, and Mark Quest, who had taken over the place, he had his own financial problems. So there was no money left to build.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to have a commercial break and come back and talk a little bit more about Wallachine, this very interesting community. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're just actually cruising through the book looking for a specific picture here. We have Larry Jacobson joining us on the show today. He has authored a book and written a book about Wallachine, which is located between Savinaw and Ashcroft. Let's take a look at the cover of this book. That way you can't see us flipping through here. I'm going to give you a second to, I think it's this way. Anyway, birth of a legend, Wallachine in its glory days, about a century ago. In its height, I believe, Larry, there are 300 people living there. Would that be right? Or no?
It's hard to tell because the only ones that count and anything I've seen are the people who were actually involved. There was a labor crew there, and then there were probably 50 Chinese people as well, besides the construction labor crew, of which would have been probably about 50 people. So there were certainly well over 200 people there.
And
250.
What was the community comprised of in terms of who were these people? They came from England. A lot of them were very affluent. Is that right?
Yes. Back in those days, in the British titled families, the eldest son inherited the estate. So younger sons were always a problem for the father to deal with.
They're the troublemakers?
No. How are you going to set up a business? You know, if you had the brains, you might get into military school, Sandhurst, or someplace like that. Or you might become a doctor. He could slave away as an apprentice in a lawyer's office for many years before he could become articled, or he could have become a church minister, maybe get a third-rate manse that wouldn't support him in the lifestyle expected of him.
Or you could come to Canada and buy an acreage.
Or you could come to Canada, South Africa. Britain, as you know, Queen Victoria could say the sun never sets in the British Empire. They had colonies all around the world. So that was one of the things there. They'd send their sons overseas to one of the colonies. Canada was a favorite place, as was South Africa at one time.
We have some pictures that we can go through. We have a few more from the second half of the book. Is this the hotel, Larry, that we're looking at here?
Yes. And I don't know what happened to it. It was torn down around 1920.
Right. And people that came over from England would stay in that hotel and wait for their houses to be built, I understand. The grand vision, I understand, of Wallachine was to have fruit orchards and make it into a very prosperous agricultural community, but that never really came to be.
Well, they actually shipped fruit. They shipped carloads of it.
Okay, so they did have some success.
Yes, they did. One of the things, of course, they discovered was that most of the land would not support fruit except the more hardy types.
Okay.
They tried growing tobacco, but it was too hot in the summer for it.
And potatoes and onions?
Yeah. And those were filler crops mostly.
Okay.
You know, while the fruit trees were coming of age. And
wasn't Barnes the man that started it all?
Yes, he's the man. And he certainly was no slouch when it came to advertising, was he?
No, he really wasn't. He wasn't afraid.
You know, we think we invented hype, but it's been around for a long time.
I don't think we should worry about trying to
it.
find this. Of course, we're trying to find one specific picture. But do tell me, in its height, several hundred people lived there at the turn of the century into 1908 through 1914. How many people, Larry, would you say live there now?
I would think that maybe 10, 12 houses are occupied.
Some of them
mostly retired people. So if you say 24 people there.
And some of them.
This fellow that's fishing there
yes.
in front, he lives in Vancouver. his father married a woman whose brother was Gordon Flowerdew. He won the Victoria Cross.
Right, and not many people won that.
No, very few. If you were alive, you certainly didn't have much chance of winning it.
Right. It's an interesting story to tell. I'm still transfixed on trying to find this picture.
Yeah.
But an interesting story to tell. And I think what makes your book so great, Larry, is that there's so many great pictures of the insides of the homes, the stories of the different families, some of the men that went off to fight in the First World War. I understand another fallacy is that people think that so many of the men from Wallachine died in that First World War, but there were very few that actually did.
Probably about 16%.
Well, that's a chunk.
Yeah, I mean, it's but they'd be the same pretty well all over. I have a table in there that shows the fatalities.
Yes, yeah.
And basically, it was about 16% for British forces.
Right, but when you're considering that
Actually killed.
Right, actually killed. But it was such a small amount in that community to begin with, anyways.
Yeah.
You know, it obviously had some crippling effect on some level.
That is certain.
We are almost out of time, I have to say, but you are going to be at Chapters tomorrow, I understand, and that will be happening at 1 o'clock, I believe, and you're welcoming people to come down and talk to you and perhaps have a book signing. And so people are welcome to come down and meet you and perhaps pick up a copy of your book. And it is a wonderful book, so good for you for doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any last words?
Well, I'm trying to stay out of trouble, that's why I write.
Good for you. You're doing a good job. You've got 3 other books there. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Quick mention, of course, again, at 1 o'clock tomorrow at Chapters, if you would like to come down and learn more about the community of Wallachine. It's a very interesting history, this community.